The salty breeze whipped through Emma's hair as she stood on the cliff overlooking the churning sea. Below, the small town of Havenbrook hugged the rugged coastline, its quaint shops and colorful houses glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, a wild expanse of gray and white that mirrored the restlessness she felt inside. 6 months ago, she'd traded the chaos of the city for this quiet corner of the world, hoping the crash of waves would drown out the echoes of her past. So far, it had worked mostly. Emma adjusted the strap of her bag, heavy with paintbrushes and half-finished canvases. She'd opened a small art studio in town, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in strokes of color and forget the mistakes she'd left behind. The townspeople were kind, if a little curious, and she'd kept them at arm's length. No one here knew who she'd been before, and that's how she intended to keep it. As she turned to head back down the winding path to town, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out, squinting at the screen. An unknown number. Probably a telemarketer, she thought. Or maybe a wrong number. But something in instinct she couldn't name made her swipe to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice cautious, barely audible over the wind. "Emma," came the reply, low and familiar, cutting through the roar of the sea like a blade. "It's been a long time." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice. Jake. Her ex-partner from the city. The one person she'd hoped never to hear from again. "What do you want?" she asked, gripping the phone tighter, her knuckles whitening. "I need to talk to you, in person. I'm in Havenbrook." The world tilted beneath her feet. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't hard. You should have covered your tracks better." Her eyes darted around the cliffside, the vast emptiness suddenly feeling like a trap. "I'm not interested, Jake. Leave me alone." "I can't do that, Emma. You owe me." "I don't owe you anything," she snapped, her voice rising with a mix of fear and defiance. "That part of my life is over." "Is it?" His tone turned sharp, menacing. "Because I think the good people of Havenbrook might be interested to know who you really are." Her stomach plummeted. "Are you threatening me?" "Just stating facts. Meet me at the diner on Main Street tomorrow at noon. Be there, or I'll start talking." The line went dead. Emma stood frozen, the wind biting at her skin, the phone still pressed to her ear. The horizon blurred as her mind raced. Her pasta tangle of secrets she'd buried deep had clawed its way back to the surface. Jake was here, in her sanctuary, threatening to unravel everything she'd built. She had no idea what he wanted, or how far he'd go. But one thing was clear. She was running out of time to decide what to do next. The wind howled louder as Emma shoved the phone back into her pocket, her hands trembling. The salty air that had once felt cleansing now stung her eyes, mixing with the tears she refused to let fall. Havenbrook, her refuge, her reset, was no longer safe. Jake's voice lingered in her mind like a ghost she couldn't exorcise low, deliberate, dripping with the arrogance she'd once mistaken for charm. She'd spent 6 months painting over her past, layering it beneath bright hues and soft landscapes. But he'd found her. And worse, he knew something enough to threaten her fragile new life. She started down the cliffside path, her boots crunching against the gravel, each step heavier than the last. The town came into view below, its warm lights flickering like a promise she wasn't sure she could trust anymore. The diner on Main Street, noon tomorrow. She had less than a day to figure out what Jake wanted and how to stop him. Her mind churned with questions. How had he tracked her down? What did he think she owed him? And what exactly was he prepared to tell the people of Havenbrook? By the time she reached the cobblestone streets of town, the sky had darkened, heavy clouds rolling in from the sea. She passed the bakery where Mrs. Calder always saved her a cinnamon roll, the bookshop where Mr. Tate waved through the window, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. These people didn't know about the late nights in the city, the deals she'd brokered, the lines she'd crossed. They saw her as Emma the artist, quiet and kind, not Emma the woman who'd once run with sharks like Jake. If he talked, that illusion would shatter. Her studio was a narrow building, wedged between a hardware store and a florist, its faded blue door creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of turpentine and damp canvas. She dropped her bag onto the wooden floor, the clatter of brushes echoing in the dim space. A half-finished painting of the cliff sat on her easel, the sea rendered in furious strokes of gray and green. She stared at it, her chest tight, then turned away. No painting would fix this. She sank into the worn armchair by the window, her mind racing. Jake had always been a gambler, ruthless, reckless, and dangerously good at reading people. Back in the city, they'd been partners, not in romance but in business. A shady operation moving art and antiques through less than legal channels. She'd been the face, charming clients with her smile, while he'd handled the backroom deals. It had worked until it didn't. 6 months ago, she'd walked away, taking nothing but her skills in a suitcase, leaving him to clean up the mess when their last deal went south. She'd assumed he'd moved on, found new pawns to play with. Apparently she'd been wrong. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text. She hesitated, then looked at the screen. Another unknown number. The message was short. "Check your mailbox." Her pulse quickened. She didn't have a mailbox at the studio, only at her cottage, a mile outside town. Whoever sent this knew where she lived. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and headed out into the gathering dusk. The walk to her cottage felt endless, the wind tugging at her clothes, the distant crash of waves a relentless drumbeat. When she reached the weathered mailbox by her gate, her fingers fumbled with the latch. Inside was a single envelope, unmarked, sealed tight. She tore it open, her breath shallow. A photograph slipped out, a grainy shot of her standing in a dimly lit warehouse, a crate of paintings behind her, a man in a suit handing her an envelope. The memory hit her like a punch. The last deal, the one that had gone wrong, the one she'd run from. Scrawled across the bottom in sharp black ink were 2 words, "You're mine." The sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance, headlights flickering through the trees. Emma shoved the photo into her pocket, her heart hammering. Someone was coming, someone who knew her secrets, her lies, her every move. And as the lights grew closer, she realized she had nowhere left to hide. The headlights sliced through the twilight, casting jagged shadows across the cottage's weathered walls. Emma's breath hitched as the car slowed, gravel crunching under its tires. She ducked behind the gate, her back pressed against the cold metal. The photograph crumpled in her fist. The engine idled for a moment, then cut off, leaving only the sound of the wind and her own ragged breathing. A car door creaked open. Footsteps low, deliberate approach the gate. "Emma?" The voice wasn't Jake's. It was softer, higher pitched, tinged with uncertainty. A woman's voice. "You out here?" Emma's mind raced. She didn't recognize it, not from Havenbrook, not from the city. Peering through a gap in the gate, she saw a figure silhouetted against the car's dim interior light. Slim, wearing a long coat, dark hair pulled back. The woman hesitated, then stepped closer, her boots scuffing the dirt. "I know you're there," the woman said, her tone sharpening. "I saw you come up the path. We need to talk." Emma's grip tightened on the gate. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden, to wait this out, but the photograph in her pocket burned like a brand. Whoever this was, they'd known exactly where to find her, and they delivered a message that tied her to Jake. She couldn't afford to ignore it. Steeling herself, she stepped out from behind the gate, keeping her distance. "Who are you?" Emma demanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And what do you want?" The woman tilted her head, studying her. Up close, she looked younger than Emma had expected, maybe late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that glinted in the faint light. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something Leaf maybe in her expression. "Name's Clara," she said, crossing her arms. "And I'm not here to hurt you, if that's what you're thinking. I'm here because of him." "Him?" Emma's stomach twisted. "Jake?" Clara nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Yeah, he's been looking for you. And he's not the only one. The words hung heavy between them, carried off by the wind. Emma's gaze darted to the car, a beat-up sedan. Nothing flashy, nothing like Jake's style. You're working with him? No, Claire said quickly, almost too quickly. I'm trying to stop him. He's got something planned, Emma. Something big, and you're the key to it. Emma laughed, a brittle sound that broke in her throat. Me? I've been gone 6 months. I don't have anything he wants. Claire's eyes narrowed. That's not what he thinks. That photo I left you, it's just the start. He's got more. Documents, recordings, enough to bury you and anyone you've gotten close to here. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against Emma's chest. Havenbrook's faces flashed through her mind: Mrs. Calder, Mr. Tate, the kids who'd started dropping by her studio to watch her paint. She'd kept them at a distance, but they'd wormed their way in anyway. If Jake had proof of her past, he could ruin them too, just by association. How do you know all this? Emma asked, stepping closer despite herself. And why should I trust you? Claire reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. She held it out, her hand steady. Because I've got my own reasons to hate him. Read this, then decide. Emma took the paper, her fingers brushing Claire's cold ones. She unfolded it, squinting in the dim light. It was a printed email, dated 3 weeks ago. The sender's name was blacked out, but the recipient was clear. Jake. The message was short, brutal. Found her. Havenbrook. She's got the ledger. Move fast. The ledger. Emma's blood ran cold. She hadn't thought about it in months. She hadn't wanted to. A leather-bound book, filled with every dirty deal she and Jake had ever made. Every bribe, every forged signature. She'd taken it when she left. A reckless insurance policy she'd hidden away and tried to forget. If Jake knew she had it. The sound of another engine rumbled in the distance, faint but growing louder. Clara's head snapped toward it, her posture tensing. We're out of time, she said, her voice low. He's coming. Right now. Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at Clara, then at the paper in her hand. The weight of her past crashing down around her. The headlights were closer now, cutting through the trees. She had seconds to choose. Trust this stranger and ruin her face, Jake, and whatever he'd brought with him. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as the headlights drew nearer, their glare slicing through the dusk like a predator's eyes. She shoved the email into her pocket, her mind a chaotic swirl of fear and calculation. Clara stood rigid, her gaze fixed on the approaching vehicle, her hand twitching toward her coat as if reaching for something hidden. The air crackled with tension, the distant roar of the engine blending with the relentless crash of waves far below. Move, Clara hissed, grabbing Emma's arm and yanking her toward the sedan. We can't stay here. Emma stumbled, her boots catching on the uneven ground, but she didn't resist. Trusting Clara was a gamble, but facing Jake here, now, with no plan, was a death sentence for the life she'd built. She wrenched open the passenger door and threw herself inside as Clara slid into the driver's seat. The engine sputtered to life, and the car lurched forward just as a black SUV rounded the bend, its tires screeching against the gravel. Go, 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 Emma shouted, twisting to look out the back window. The SUV's headlights flooded the rearview mirror, blinding her for a split second. She caught a glimpse of its sleek frame, too polished, too expensive for Havenbrook. It was Jake's style, all right. He never did anything subtle. Clara floored the gas, the sedan rattling as it sped down the narrow road toward town. Hold on, she muttered, her knuckles white on the wheel. The SUV gained ground fast, its engine growling like a beast on the hunt. Emma braced herself against the dashboard, her mind racing. The ledger. That damned book. She'd stashed it in the studio, buried under a loose floorboard, a secret she'd thought was safe. If Jake knew about it, he'd tear Havenbrook apart to get it. Who are you? Emma demanded, her voice sharp over the whine of the engine. You show up with cryptic warnings and a photo, and now we're running for our lives? I need answers, Clara. Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. I worked for him, she said, the words clipped. Not like you did. I was freelance. Cleaned up his messes, tracked people down until I saw what he does to the ones who cross him. She swerved around a pothole, the car jolting. I got out. Barely. Then I heard he was after you. Emma's stomach churned. And the ledger? How does he know I have it? He doesn't know, Clara said, her tone grim. He suspects. That email? I intercepted it. Someone's been watching you, Emma. Feeding him intel. I don't know who. The SUV rammed them from behind, the impact slamming Emma forward. She gasped, pain shooting through her shoulder as the seatbelt bit into her skin. Clara cursed, wrestling the wheel as the sedan fishtailed. They're not playing, she growled. We need to lose them. The road twisted ahead, flanked by dense trees on one side and a steep drop to the sea on the other. Emma's eyes darted to the side mirror. The SUV was inches away, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Jake? Someone he'd sent? Either way, they weren't stopping. Turn left up ahead, Emma said suddenly, an idea sparking. There's a fishing trail narrow, off the main road. They won't follow us there. Clara shot her a skeptical look, but nodded. Your call. The turn came fussed, a barely visible gap in the trees. Clara yanked the wheel, the sedan skidding onto the dirt path, branches scraping the sides with a shriek. The SUV overshot, its brakes squealing as it tried to double back. For a moment, the headlights vanished, swallowed the forest. Emma let out a shaky breath, but it didn't last. The growl of the engine returned, fainter but still too close. The trail was a nightmare, rutted and overgrown, the sedan bouncing violently as Clara pushed it to its limits. This better work, she muttered, her voice tight. It will, Emma said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The trail led to an old, pure abandoned, rickety, but a dead end. If they could reach it, maybe they could ditch the car, hide in the dunes. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. The trees thinned ahead, the pier's silhouette looming against the stormy sky. Clara slowed, scanning the darkness. What now? Emma opened her mouth to answer, but a sharp crack cut through the air. A gunshot. The rear window shattered, glass spraying across the back seat. Clara ducked, swearing, and Emma's heart stopped. They weren't just chasing her anymore. They were done playing games. Drive, Emma yelled, adrenaline flooding her veins. The pier was too close, and beyond it, the sea churned, wild and unforgiving. Another shot rang out, the bullet pinging off the car's frame. Clara gunned the engine, the sedan hurtling toward the edge as the SUV burst through the trees behind them, lights blazing. The pier's end rushed toward them, planks rattling beneath the tires. Emma's mind screamed at her to jump, to run, but there was no time. The car skidded, teetering on the brink, and then, with a sickening lurch, it plunged over the edge, the dark water rising to swallow them whole. The world turned upside down as the sedan plummeted, the icy grip of the sea rushing up to meet them. Emma's scream lodged in her throat, drowned out by the deafening crash of water against metal. The car hit the surface hard, jolting her forward, the seatbelt cutting into her chest. Freezing salt water poured through the shattered rear window, flooding the cabin in seconds. Darkness swallowed everything sight. Sound. Hopey as the vehicle sank, bubbles streaming past the windshield like frantic ghosts. Emma. Clara's voice broke through the chaos, hoarse and urgent. We've got to get out now. Emma fumbled with her seatbelt, her fingers numb and clumsy in the cold. The water was up to her waist, rising fast, the pressure pinning her against the seat. She yanked at the buckle, panic clawing at her chest, until it finally clicked free. Clara was already kicking at her door, but it wouldn't budge. The sea held it shut like a vice. The window, Emma shouted, her voice trembling as the water climbed to her shoulders. She twisted toward the passenger side, shoving at the glass with all her strength. It gave way with a groan, the current rushing in to drag her under. She fought it, lungs burning, and pulled herself through, the jagged edge scraping her arm. Clara followed, her dark hair plastered to her face as she surfaced beside Emma, gasping. Above them, the pier loomed, a shadowed outline against the stormy sky. The SUV's headlights cut through the night, sweeping the water's edge. They hadn't given up. The beam swung closer, illuminating the waves, and Emma ducked beneath the surface, pulling Clara with her. The cold was a living thing, sinking into her bones, slowing her movements. She kicked toward the pier's pilings, the rough wood scraping her hands as she clung to it for cover. Clara pressed in beside her, both of them shivering, their breaths shallow and ragged. The headlights lingered, then moved on, the engine's rumble fading into the wind. "They think we're dead," Clara whispered, her teeth chattering. "For now." Emma nodded, her mind racing despite the numbness creeping through her. The car was gone, sunk to the bottom of the bay, but the ledger was still out there hidden in the studio. If Jake thought she was gone, he'd go after it himself. She couldn't let that happen. "We need to get back to town," she said, her voice low but firm. "Before he figures it out." Clara's eyes widened. "You're insane. We're soaked, half frozen, and they just tried to kill us. We should lay low." "No," Emma cut in, her jaw tightening. "He's not stopping. If he gets that ledger, it's over for me, for you, for everyone I've dragged into this. We move now, or we lose everything." Clara stared at her, then gave a sharp nod. "Fine, but we're not walking back like this. Too exposed." Emma scanned the shoreline, her gaze landing on a cluster of rocks near the dunes. "There's a fisherman's shack up there. Old man Reese used to keep gear in it. Might be something we can use." They hauled themselves out of the water, crouching low as they staggered across the sand. The wind bit at their drenched clothes, but adrenaline kept Emma moving. The shack was little more than a lean-to, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and salt, but it was dry. A tarp-covered pile in the corner revealed a moth-eaten blanket, a rusted lantern, and thankfully a set of keys dangling from a nail. "Boat keys," Emma said, snatching them up. "Reese keeps a skiff tied nearby. If it's still there, we can cut across the bay to town." Clara wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, her expression grim. "And if it's not, then we're walking," Emma replied, already heading for the door. "Come on." The skiff was there, bobbing against a weathered dock 50 yards down the shore. It was small, its paint peeling, but the motor coughed to life after a few tugs. They climbed in, huddling low as Emma steered into the choppy waves. The lights of Havenbrook glimmered ahead, a beacon pulling her forward. Her arm throbbed where the window had cut her, and exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but she gripped the tiller tight. No turning back now. As they neared the town's edge, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a figure standing on the cliff above, silhouetted against the storm clouds. Too far to see clearly, but the posture was unmistakable. Jake. Watching. Waiting. "He's already here," Emma said, her voice barely audible over the motor. She cut the engine, letting the skiff drift silently toward the shore. The studio wasn't far just beyond the docks, nestled in the heart of town. If they could reach it first, get the ledger, they might have a chance to turn this around. Clara leaned closer, her breath warm against Emma's ear. "He's not alone. Look." Emma followed her gaze. Two more figures emerged from the shadows near the docks, their flashlight beams sweeping the water. Jake's men, closing in. The skiff bumped against the shore, and Emma's heart sank. They were out of time and out of options, unless she could pull off something Jake would never expect. The skiff rocked gently as it nudged the shore, the cold seeping deeper into Emma's bones. The flashlight beams from Jake's men danced across the water, inches from catching the boat's chipped hull. She crouched lower, her mind spinning, the weight of the ledger and everything it represented pressing down on her. Clara's eyes met hers, wide with urgency, silently asking the same question. What now? Emma's gaze flicked to the cliff where Jake stood, a dark sentinel overlooking his trap. He thought he had her cornered, thought she'd either drown or crawl back to him. But she wasn't the same person who'd run from the city 6 months ago. Havenbrook had changed her, given her something worth fighting for. and she wasn't about to let him take it. "Stay here," she whispered to Clara, slipping the boat keys into her hand. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, get out of here." Clara grabbed her wrist, her grip fierce. "You're not facing him alone." "I'm not facing him at all," Emma said, a spark of resolve igniting in her chest. "Not yet. Trust me." Before Clara could argue, Emma slid over the skiff's edge, her boots sinking into the shallow, icy water. She waded toward the docks, keeping low, the shadows of the pilings her only cover. The men's voices drifted closer, gruff, impatient, their beams slicing through the night. She held her breath as one swept past her, missing her by a hair. The studio was 100 yards inland, a straight shot if she could dodge them. She waited until the men turned toward the water, then bolted, her wet clothes dragging at her legs. The cobblestone street was slick underfoot, but she didn't stop, her pulse hammering as she reached the studio's faded blue door. She fumbled with her keys, the lock clicking open just as a shout echoed from the docks. They'd spotted the skiff. Inside, the air was still, the faint scent of paint a stark contrast to the chaos outside. She darted to the easel, shoving it aside, and pried up the loose floorboard with trembling hands. The ledger was there, small, leather-bound, its edges worn from years of secrets. She clutched it to her chest, a weapon and a curse all at once. Footsteps pounded outside, voices barking orders. No time to run. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the old rotary phone on her desk, a relic she'd kept for charm. An idea flared, desperate but possible. She grabbed it, dialing the only number she knew by heart. Mrs. Calder's bakery. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Emma?" Mrs. Calder's warm voice crackled through. "Bit late for a call, dear." "Listen," Emma cut in, keeping her voice low. "I need help. Men are outside my studio, dangerous men. Tell everyone you can. Make noise. Bring people, please." A pause, then. "I'm on it." The line went dead. Emma sank behind the desk, the ledger tight in her grip, and waited. Seconds stretched into eternity, the men's footsteps circling the building. A fist pounded on the door, rattling the frame. "We know you're in there, Emma," one of them growled, not Jake, but close enough to make her skin crawl. Then faintly a new sound rose, shouts. Not from the docks, but from deeper in town. Lights flickered on in the windows across the street, silhouettes moving. Mrs. Calder had done it. The pounding on the door stopped, replaced by muttered curses and retreating steps. Emma peeked through the window, her breath catching. A small crowd was forming. Mr. Tate with his flashlight, the florist wielding a broom, kids peering from behind their parents. Havenbrook was waking up. The men hesitated, then scattered as the crowd grew louder, their flashlights vanishing into the night. Up on the cliff, Jake's figure lingered a moment longer, then turned away, swallowed by the darkness. He wasn't gone and not for good, but for now she'd won. The door creaked open, and Clara slipped inside, soaked and wide-eyed. "What the hell did you do?" Emma held up the ledger, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Called in reinforcements." Clara exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief. "That won't stop him forever." "No," Emma agreed, standing straighter, the weight of the town's lights behind her. "But it's a start. He thinks I'm alone. He's wrong." Outside, the wind howled, carrying the voices of Havenbrook, her sanctuary, her shield. Jake would be back, and the ledger's secret still loomed. But for the first time in months, Emma felt something stronger than fear. Hope. She'd built a life here, and she'd fight to keep it. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it running. Not anymore.